Good morning, everyone, and welcome. The topic of today's online event is Food Cost Dynamics, Insights into Fruits and Wheat. My name is Brandy Yanchik. I'm an independent journalist and documentary filmmaker who is based in Edmonton, Alberta, which is in Treaty 6 territory. I'd like to acknowledge the diverse Indigenous peoples whose ancestors' footprints have marked this territory for centuries, such as the Nehayao, Cree, Dene, Anishinaabe, Saulteaux, Nakota Ishka, Nakota Sioux, Niitsitapi, Blackfoot peoples. I also acknowledge this as the Métis homeland and the home of one of the largest communities of Inuit south of the 60th parallel. Before I introduce today's panelists, a couple of quick housekeeping items. If you're having difficulties hearing the webinar at any time today, or you are experiencing an unreliable internet signal, you can always use the call-in number included in your webinar registration email, or by clicking the arrow next to the microphone icon and pressing switch to phone audio. There is a box labeled Q&A. This is where you can pose your questions to the panelists. If you see a question in the Q&A box that you think is important to ask, you can also click the thumbs up icon on the question to move it to the front of the queue. We will also have a couple of poll questions for you. Today's event will consist of the presentations by our panelists, followed by some questions after each presentation. We will then have a panel discussion around the topic. Please be aware that this event is being recorded. The recording will be uploaded to YouTube, and you will receive a link in an email along with a post-event survey. We will be taking clips from the video and posting these on social media. We do hope that today's event promotes more discussion with a broad diversity of participants. Today, I am joined by two distinguished speakers for this discussion. Alison Fradella, an economist with Statistics Canada, and Jim Verkaman from the University of British Columbia, and he holds a joint appointment with the Faculty of Land and Food Systems, as well as the Sauder School of Business. Welcome. Before we begin, we have a poll question for the audience. In the Consumer Price Index, food is one of the 8 components. How does food rank in terms of financial importance? 1, largest; 2, smallest; 3, second largest; 4, second smallest. You have 30 seconds to answer the poll, after which we will display the results. Okay, the poll is ending, and our results are 25% of participants said that food is the largest of the 8 components in the Consumer Price Index. 5% think the food is the smallest component. 60% believe that food is the second largest component, and 10% of participants believe that food is the second smallest component in the Consumer Price Index. Okay, and the answer to the Zoom poll is, according to Statistics Canada, the answer is option 3. Food has the second largest weight of the 8 major components of the Consumer Price Index. I will now invite Alison Fradella to start the discussion. As you listen to her presentation, can you please think of some questions that you'd like to ask her and put them in the Q&A box? In your question, please tell us your name and a bit about yourself, such as your location and your profession. Thank you, Alison.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that introduction, Brandy. Okay, well, thank you all for joining today. I'm excited to share details about Statistic Canada's Food Price Data Hub and to discuss price change within the wheat supply chain. My presentation will provide a quick overview of general producer and consumer price change dynamics, followed by an overview and demonstration of Statistic Canada's Food Price Data Hub. And then using data from the Food Price Data Hub, I'll provide analysis on price change within the wheat supply chain from both the producer and consumer lens. So we can probably jump to the next slide. All right, perfect. So as you can see on my presentation agenda, we're just going to run through food price influences. So Actually, I think I need the next slide, actually. Perfect. Thank you, Julius. Okay. So price level change impacts producers and consumers. When input prices rise, producers are often directly impacted, even if long-term contracts are in place. Fuel surcharges are an example of how producers may experience price rise for an input, even when long-term price contracts are in place. And depending on the commodity, producers, suppliers, and retailers along the supply chain will often absorb cost increases for as long as possible before passing them on to consumers. And this is due to market competition and position within the marketplace. There is more volatility in producer prices versus consumer prices. So the adage, what comes up must come down, isn't always the situation for either producers or consumers. However, producers tend to experience more price volatility than consumers. So, for example, the ups and downs of energy costs for barn heating or diesel fuel pricing, for example. And so here at Statistics Canada, we've developed the Food Price Data Hub to highlight price fluctuations and provide real-time food price data. And the food inflation, of course, it's been topical for years and rightfully so. So we're proud to have developed a product that provides robust analysis and data from the producer to consumer level within the supply chain. Next slide, please. All right, so this is the top of the landing page from the Food Price Data Hub. And so what we'll be doing is just working our way down on the Food Price Data Hub and just going through each section, and I'll do a demonstration to show you how you can customize food price data that's housed here. So the top of the landing page features the most recent consumer price index. It's the all items figure compared to the food purchase from stores index. All of our visualizations are automated to be updated the same day that we release our fresh data here at StatsCan. And the CPI, so what that is, it's the official measure of inflation. So what these figures are indicating is where food inflation is currently compared to the overall inflationary rate for all goods and services tracked in the CPI. So reflecting the importance of food purchase from stores for Canadian, as we just went through with the poll, the food component is the second largest index of the 8 major components in the consumer price index. So it amounts to about 16.65% of the CPI basket weight, with food purchase from stores equating to about 11%, 11.04. And from the snapshot here of the CPI, you can really see when grocery prices began outpacing headline inflation in late 2021. Notable commodities that could lead this price rise for the index was meat and wheat products. And you'll also notice here 2 visualization tools on the right. I use them daily. They're really handy. You can see historic and current data visualization. So they're a really great snapshot into what's happening. And lastly here, you may have noticed that the CPI graph is linked to the dataset table below. And when you click on this table, you can customize the dataset and download data that meet your individual parameters. So our datasets allows users to customize geography, reference periods, and commodities or services included in the CPI. And so with that, what I'll do is I will take over and give you a demonstration of the Food Price Data Hub, just so you know how to customize your own data, because it's really useful. And so what I'll do is I'll quickly share my screen here. Okay. So you'll see here, this is the Food Price Data Hub. This is the portion that we were just reviewing. And if you scroll down and click on the table source, this is where you can jump to customize the CPI data. So you see here, it automatically brings you to the aggregated Canada level for the current period. Our last release was March 2024 CPI. There's a month lag, so the next update will be released next week. But you can see here, it brings you right to indices with the last month's figure, this month's figure, last year's figure. And you can compare the index values, but also see the price change on the right-hand side. So it's indexed to 2002. So there's quite a bit of data here. But if we go up and press Add Remove Data, this is where you can customize the data set that you can download. So if we scroll down, we can clear all. We'll go and we'll pick Alberta because we're an Alberta heavy crowd today, I think. So if we click Alberta from the geography, and then if we go over to products and grouping, we're going to clear all at first. But you can see here, you can scroll down and you can customize all sorts of things. So this is within the food component itself. You're able to dive down to different layers. You can select multiple indexes, sub-indices, different commodity groupings. For this example, we're going to select bakery products. So that's within the bakery and cereal products index. So perfect, bakery products. and we'll leave it at the current reference period. So we just go down and press apply. It's going to generate. So as we've done here, we did Alberta, we did bakery products, and you can see here it gives us the index value for last March 2023. It gave us the previous month of February. It also gave us the last most recent data set of March 2024. And on the right-hand side, it gives you the percentage change. So we can see here with these index values, February to March 2024, the 1 month change was a negative 1.8%, so a price decline. We can see year over year, however, it's actually a price increase of 3.1% for bakery products in the province of Alberta. And you can also download these options if you like. You can download your data set and then you can customize and use the data for your own analytical projects. So that is just a quick overview of the Data Hub. And I'll give the control back to Julius to continue on with our slides. Perfect. Okay, we can go to the next slide. Amazing. Okay. And so further down on the Food Price Data Hub, you can see that we have additional things like our monthly average retail prices table. So this is something that is a complementary product to the CPI, and it provides it provides the average prices Canadian pays for selected products in a given month. It really focuses on food products and products that you can buy from grocery outlets, such as laundry detergent and soap. Of the 110 products included in the table, 106 are food products. But just a quick note, though, the CPI is a fixed basket weight structure and compares the same products and goods over time, whereas this average prices table has product rotation. So as such, the average prices table they're a nice complementary snapshot to see what Canadians are paying on average in a given month, but they should not be used over time as a time series comparison. So we recommend the CPI, since it's Canada's official measure of inflation, be used as a time series comparison. But on the left-hand side there, you'll see there's links associated to data sets for food production and pricing, and there's also comparative data from OECD nations. So the data sets that are housed here really range. They can be anything from fruit and vegetable consumption to the industrial product price index. Next slide, please. Okay, perfect. And so beneath this section, the visualization of data sets are broken into 3 categories, and the categories show price dynamics for costs to move food products from producers to consumers. And these visualizations are meant to be a quick snapshot of cost and price change with an arrow next to the most recent figure, and this is indicating how it compares to the previous released cost level. You'll also see that there's a release date included, so you know it's the most recent data set, or you know the timeline of the most recent data. So it's a really useful starting point to see trends, outliers, and just the general direction that prices are moving in. Next slide, please. Perfect. And so lastly, the bottom of the landing page of the Food Price Data Hub, it includes supplementary data products and that are related to food pricing. So this houses the most newest, enjoyable analytic products like infographics, podcasts. We also have a personal inflation calculator tool. And there's also analytical papers here as well. So we've recently just released a new food inflation podcast, as well as a food technical paper that's going to be released shortly. So this is where it would be housed. You can check out the newest content. Next slide, please. All right, so switching gears, I'm just going to now discuss wheat-based product price change in recent years, and I'm using data that was strictly available on the Food Price Data Hub. Please note, though, I know there's different classes of wheat varieties in Canada, but I'm not going to distinguish between them. When I mention wheat, it's just at an aggregated level. So notably, wheat prices have been impacted by overarching and interconnected global issues. A big one would be the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which led to trade embargoes and important inputs, as well as wheat itself, among these commodities that were no longer being traded. Also tied to the invasion of Ukraine was a spike in wheat future markets. The wheat future markets is quite reactive, so the war between 2 major wheat producing and exporting nations led to record prices for wheat futures. Other major global price pressures impacting wheat pricing is supply reduction due to drought, heat waves, frost, and wildfires, not just domestically, but abroad as well. Of course, anytime supply is reduced amid high demand, price pressures will be prevalent. So with those factors in mind, we'll take a look at input price change and that wheat producers have experienced. Next slide, please. Okay, so the graph on the left shows the quarterly percentage change of machinery fuel costs alongside fertilizer and pesticide costs. Machinery fuel is not a large input for wheat farmers, but there is price volatility as the graph shows. It peaked around mid-2022, and this is tied with the invasion of Ukraine and the subsequent anxieties about global energy security, and that contributed to the upward price movement. Next, you'll note fertilizer costs. So that also too can be tied to the invasion of Ukraine, most notably due to the global trade embargoes. Belarus and Russia are top producing nations of potash. Together, they supply about 40% of global supply. And Russia itself is a big producer of the big three fertilizer types that's used in commercial farming. So then compounding this pressure as well, Ukraine's also a producer of fertilizer and potash. So together, Russia and Ukraine export about 30% of global fertilizer stocks. So you can see that big price movement. Pesticides also saw a price increase, although it looks small relative to the other input cost change on this graph because they were so large. But the increase of pesticide costs between 2021 and 2022 are actually the highest recorded price increases for this index since it began tracking in 2002. And then quickly on the right-hand side, you'll note packaging materials and container prices spiked. This is attributed to COVID-19. So China's zero COVID policy led to production and shipping shortages of vital packaging materials and containers while demand remained constant. So although producers aren't as impacted by packaging, containers, and materials, it's still a pressure that manufacturers would have to absorb all along the supply chain. So extra price pressures can impact consumer pricing, and this is part of that picture. Next slide, please. Okay, all right, perfect. Okay, additional costs producers incur is farm labor. So average hourly agricultural wages increased 7% between 2021 and 2023. And another input cost that may not initially come to mind is insurance and stabilization premiums. So stabilization premiums are expenses that farmers pay to belong to stabilization programs that that support either farm income or prices for selected commodities. And they're important, and they typically assist with production volatilities tied to disease outbreak and climate. Climate volatility has led to reduced outputs and increased the volume of insurance claim as well as ag recovery initiatives, which in turn have led to higher insurance and stabilization premium costs for producers. So as the graph shows in the left, there have been some production years with lower than average production levels and output. This is tied to climate volatilities impacted harvest areas like droughts, heat waves, and frosts, but also as well as reduced harvest areas. So farmers may opt to grow a different, more stable crop or a variety due to break-even prices that are required with farming, or they may close farming operations altogether if break-even costs are exceeding income or when future volatilities are just too great of a risk. The graph on the right shows that land and building values have been rising across Canada, as we know. With a high interest rate environment and higher valuations, this too is a higher cost for producers, even if it's considered an asset. Next slide, please. Right. So once wheat has been harvested, cleaned, and packaged, producers have to pay the cost of transporting the grain to market, which is primarily done via railways. There's also new costs associated with transportation and shipping, such as fuel surcharges implemented via railway companies to assist with fluctuating fuel prices for long-term contracts. So it's something that producers have to absorb, even though there's a maximum revenue entitlement for Western Canada. The MRE doesn't guarantee farmers certain rates for rail transpo, but it limits the total revenue the railways can receive transporting Western grain. Even with the revenue caps in place, producers still have experienced higher transportation rates, especially Eastern producers. And then also here, you'll see the trucking freight rate. So there was an uptick in pricing due to logistic reconfigurations and higher demand during the COVID-19 pandemic. Some of us may remember there were job vacancies, high demand, and that was compounding the issues. So as we can see here on the graph, prices remain elevated for both rail and trucking freight. Next slide, please. Perfect. Okay, so comparing the wheat raw materials price index to the industrial product price index, we can see that the price impact from the supply chain pressures that we've highlighted so far in the previous slides on wheat prices, you can see the impact that the manufacturers have to absorb. You can also see how price movements make it diluted or delayed within the manufacturing sector. Canadian wheat producers are price takers, meaning the market sets the prices for Canadian wheat, not the producers. So it's a movement that isn't designated by Canadian producers. Next slide, please. Perfect. Wholesaler and retail margins are the last stop when getting goods to consumers. As the graph shows, both wholesaler and retailer margins have increased since mid-2022 and remain elevated. And so this is applying upward pressure on food product prices as well. I'm sure you've all heard a lot about this in the news lately. Next slide, please. Okay. So switching now from producer to consumer prices, consumer prices has experienced inflationary pressures, many of which appeared late 2021 during the COVID-19 pandemic. And as you can see on the graph, prices still remain elevated. We have seen some slowing of price growth for wheat products, however, as you can see on the graph. Aside from the external pressures impacting food producers as we've gone through, there are central non-production factors impacting food, for example, shrinkflation, alongside the higher retail margins we just reviewed. So shrinkflation is a factor, and what that is, it's when a product has a quantity reduction while the price has remained constant, or in some cases, the price actually increases. So an example would be an 8-pack of rolls is now a 6-pack, but the price remained constant, or the price is actually now more expensive for your 6-pack of buns. The graph shows the index level for wheat-based products tracked in the CPI, highlighting the rise of inflation for these items. Although the timelines of producer price spikes aligns to the price increases in consumer goods, it's not always the case. So basically, correlation isn't necessarily causation. Just because producer prices are rising, it doesn't mean consumer prices are rising. However, producer price change can be an indicator in the direction of which consumer prices may go, and it can assist with assessing global food price trends. And just talking about global price trends, some quick notes about the Canadian wheat market in consumer prices is that we're actually insulated to a lot of the price volatilities compared to those experienced in emerging economies. This is mostly attributed to our domestic agricultural production capabilities, as well as tight regional trade agreements we have in place. So, for example, the Canada-US-Mexico agreement. Food pricing has a strong seasonality, which impacts pricing. However, through these trade relations that we have, we're kind of we're not as impacted by major supply shocks as other economies or other countries. However, we're not immune. So, for example, the lettuce price spikes in 2022, 2023 after disease outbreak reduced supplies from crops in California. That's an example. And the chart below the graph just shows a year-over-year price change for some selected wheat-based products. We can see that consumer price growth is slowing. However, when we look at a longer time horizon, for example, using 2021 as a benchmark, and I picked this because this is before prices for food really began to rise and outpace headline inflation, we can see the price level remains elevated. So it's all to say inflation's easing, but price levels remain high. So the adage of what comes up must come down doesn't always fully apply to food prices. Next slide, please. All right, so in conclusion, so input costs can experience price volatility due to erratic climate, geopolitical tensions, global pandemic, and this can limit supply and production of vital supply. Producers absorb price fluctuations as long as possible. However, production costs for some commodities may exceed break-even prices, challenging the viability of these operations over the long run. And producer revenues can be highly volatile due to fluctuations in production volumes and prices from year to year. Consumer pricing is typically insulated from input price volatilities and supply shocks, but they are not immune. Thank you so much for your time. That's it.
Fantastic presentation, Allison. That's a lot. There's a lot of information there that we all can learn from, and I love all the different tools, podcasts. We have had some people asking where they can get the link to the StatsCan Food Price Data Hub and other resources, and that link will be sent in a post-event email. So thank you so much, Allison. I do have one question for you before we move on to a poll, and the question is, your graph shows that prices for wheat-based products such as pasta, breakfast cereal, and bread have risen as much as 20% over the past 2 years. Are wheat producers benefiting a great deal from these higher selling prices? If not, who is benefiting?
Yeah, no, that's a really great question. Unfortunately, producers aren't, making a lot of bank. They're not the ones reaping the increase of prices here. Unfortunately, the higher consumer prices for wheat and wheat-based products are not majorly benefiting producers, but the price increases is due to higher costs along the supply chain, but also the processing and manufacturing side, as well as wholesale and retailer margins. So it's kind of those along the supply chain that are taking a little bit more, filling their pockets a little bit more. It's not necessarily producers.
Okay, thank you so much. That's great. Now, before we hear from our next guest speaker, we're going to do another quick poll question, and you will have 30 seconds to answer the poll. What percentage of the consumer food dollar goes to the farm? One, less than 15%, two, between 20% and 4%, 40%, or three, around 50%, or four, more than 50%. You have 30 seconds. Okay, here comes our answers. In response to the Zoom question, 83% of participants said that they think that less than 15% of consumer food dollars go to the farm. 17% believe that number is between 20% and 40%, and 0% say it's around 50%, and 0% of participants think that more than 50% of consumer food dollars goes to the farm. And the answer to the Zoom poll is option one. Less than 15% of consumer food dollars go to the producer. Wow. Okay, so let's invite Jim Verkaman to share his presentation now. Please remember to type your questions in the Q&A box. When you ask your question, please tell us your name and a bit about yourself, such as your location and your profession. Thank you, Jim.
All right, thank you. Delighted to be here as well. Allison, great presentation. I learned a lot. I can't wait to share the Data Hub with my students when I'm teaching this fall. So good job. I'm going to switch gears. I'm not going to talk about wheat. I'm going to talk about apple and grape markets. Even though I grew up in Saskatchewan on a wheat farm, I've been in British Columbia for a long time. So apples and grapes are a dominant crop here in British Columbia. So what will I talk about today? Well, I'm going to talk about apples and grapes in British Columbia and Washington State. Washington State has some great data. So and I think BC sector is similar to Washington, so we can learn a lot from the data from Washington State. As the poll just talked about, what's the farmer's share of the consumer food dollar? And we'll be specific regarding that. And then we're going to examine inflation for farm inputs and sales for the grape sector and the apple sector. And we'll look at the extent that the farm price is influenced by production shortfalls. And then we'll turn to, can apple growers actually make a living growing apples? And that's a really important question for apple growers. And finally, we'll look at what's the implications of climate change for BC grape growers. It's certainly been in the news lately. Okay, so who gets the food dollar? The dollar you spend on food, where does it go? Well, this is some great data from the USDA because they break it down very carefully. And I have two snapshots here. On the left, we have it from 2002. On the right, we have it from 2022. And as the poll suggested, yes, consumer dollar is ending up with less than 15% going to the actual farmer. So 11% in 2002 and still barely 13% in 2022. Where is it all going to? Well, here we see that, over about 25% of it is going to food processing. So not surprisingly, we like processed food, so we have to pay for it. So that's where a lot of our dollar is going. And then wholesaling is another big chunk of it. Maybe some more surprisingly is that the energy and the transportation isn't such a big component. In fact, it's less than 10%. So even though we import a lot of food from California, like lettuce and things like that, it actually doesn't add a lot to our food bill and the transportation component. But so when we think about a carbon tax that's going to make energy and transportation more expensive, yeah, it's not going to raise the price of our food so much, which has sort of been something that a lot of people have been concerned about with the carbon tax because it's got such a relatively low share in our food dollar. Now, here's a specific example. This is Washington State apples. The top line here is what the consumer pays, although it's priced in dollars per carton, not per pound. And you can see, and the bottom line here is what the farmers get. So it's a bit better for apples. They're getting about 25% of the price. But then again, an apple isn't processed. An apple from the grower is basically an apple in the store, except it's been stored and maybe, packaged a little bit. So it's quite kind of discouraging for apple growers that they're getting such a small percentage of what consumers pay when all that happens is basically storage and some transportation and some wholesaling. So that's we'll come back to this to see why. And, it's difficult for apple growers to actually cover their costs, even though consumers are paying a pretty high price for their apples. Okay, so why don't we turn it around and we say, when a farmer spends $1 on farm inputs, where does it go? Well, we might think that apples and grapes are similar. They're both a fruit, so we would expect it to be similar. Actually, it's very different. So let's look at this left here. This is 2019 data from Washington Gala apples. And apples have to be stored and marketed. So by far, the biggest component of farm expenditure is paying the packing houses to store their apples, sort their apples, and get it into the retail sector. Labor is the next sizable component. But if you go over to grapes, you get a very different story because these grapes are being made into wine almost immediately after being harvested. So it's hardly anything being spent on marketing and storage. But the labor component is huge. It's most of the cost is labor. So what one can imagine if you have inflation in the wage rate or a shortage of workers, the VC sector, the wine sector is going to get hurt a lot more than the apple sector. On the other hand, if you have inflation in sort of the cost of packing houses, capital costs, this sector will get hit a lot worse. So it really depends on where the inflation is going to happen. Okay. So the media really focuses on food inflation at the consumer level. Every month we hear how much we're paying at the grocery store, but farmers have had, and as Allison pointed out, farmers have had just as rough a time of their input costs. So here we see starting in about 2021, fuel prices surged up. The cost of repairing machinery surged up, fertilizer, interest on the debt. The red line is sort of the overall index of costs. So fortunately, it's flattening out, but it's remaining elevated. It's not coming back down to where we were. So like compared to 2-3 years ago, farm inputs are just so much higher. So the question to ask is, are farmers able to sell their fruits at a higher price to cover this higher input costs? Well, let's have a look at this. So here we see, now we're back to Statistics Canada data. So the blue line is the index of farm inputs, okay? And this is overall farm inputs, not just fruit. But then you look at the green line, it's the index of the fruit price. So it looks like farmers have been able to pass on their higher input costs by demanding a higher fruit price. Unfortunately for farmers, it doesn't work that way. They're largely price takers. They don't demand any price. They get the price that the market gives them. It's just coincidental that the input prices and the fruit prices are going up. They're both being driven by overall general inflation. And so in this sector, at least, they probably have covered they haven't been left behind too badly, but that's not the case for all sectors. Now, here's a question that's interesting. This is now the Washington Cabernet wine grapes. And the question is, how does production affect price? On this axis here, we have the price per ton of grapes. And on this axis, we have the total production of grapes. And here we have the various years. So for example, 2018 was a great year. Lots of grapes were produced. It must have been great weather. And the price was around $1,500 per ton. On the other hand, back in 2013 and 2014 here, the production was much lower and the price was still $1,500 per ton. Some years they had a high production and high price, other years a low production and a low price. So what it says is that the grape producers really have little market power. They just take what the market gives them. So it means their revenue is going to be highly variable depending on both their production and price, which is sort of somewhat independent. On the other hand, if we move into the apple sector, Washington State again, we see a much stronger negative correlation between production and price. Once again, on this axis, we have production. This axis, we have price. Here is the good years for the apple growers. The weather was good. They have high yields. We produce lots of apples. But the high production means that you have to sell those apples at a lower price. So high production, low price. Some years the yield isn't so good, cool weather, damp weather, so production is lower because we're in the lower half now. But because of the lower production, they get a high price. So in the apple sector, they're getting the self-insurance. Whenever they have low production, they're offset by a higher price and vice versa. So that's probably better than in the wine sector where they don't have that sort of self-insurance. Now, let's take a look at can apple growers actually make a living growing apples? And this is Washington State, and it'll be probably similar for British Columbia. And this here, the numbers in the table, these are your break-even prices. This is the price in dollars per bin that you need to cover all your cost. This is your land, your direct cost, your land cost, your management cost, your depreciation, all the fair costs that a farmer should get compensated. This is the price that they should get. As the land price goes up, we see their break-even price is getting higher and higher, which is of course expected. As the interest rate goes up, going down this way, we see the break-even price going higher. So we go all the way from $6.58 up to $6.94. Likewise, if you have to pay your workers a higher rate because of the wage inflation, their break-even price goes up, which is expected. And more importantly, if you have to pay the packing houses a higher price because their costs are higher, their break-even price rapidly escalates all the way from $6.58 up to $7.38. The sad part is these break-even prices are well above the price that farmers are actually receiving back in 2019. Hopefully the situation is better now, but we don't have this more recent data. So here, there's no way that these apple growers can cover all of their costs. What are they doing? Well, they're either working off farm or they're simply getting a negative return. Their land is paid for and they're simply not getting a return on their land, and they're probably getting very little for their time. It's sort of they're doing it for the love of farming rather than for as a competitive sector. How about if we take out land costs and machinery depreciation and all these overhead costs? Well, the situation is better, but still not great. Now, depending on where we are with wages and packing costs, you might be able to cover your costs, but here, even so, you're barely able to cover your direct costs. So kind of dismal. And you saw earlier, the retail price of apples is so high, and the farmers are really getting a small share of that, and are not able to cover their costs. So it's kind of discouraging for apple growers. That's why so many of them are just sort of leaving and planting grapes instead, which is more profitable. Now let's talk about climate change. And, you know, for many years, since 2000, the grape sector in British Columbia just expanded continually. Soft fruit growers like, plums and peaches, they were leaving that sector. It was too hard to grow and not enough return. Everybody was producing grapes because of the high demand for wine. And then the climate change started messing things up. We had some poor years here, and this is because of lower yield of grapes. And everyone was hoping for a reversal to trend. And instead, what did we get? In January of this year, a very, very nasty frost came in and pretty much wiped out all of the buds on the grapevines. So we're not going to have hardly any grapes produced this year. And we're only now learning about the long-term damage to the plants. Some of the plants will have to get replanted, and then we're 2 or 3 years before we can produce any more grapes. So it's a really big hit for British Columbia. They might have to import grapes from Ontario in order to fulfill winery demand. And finally, if to make matters worse, we see that this forest fires and ongoing wildfires are creating smoke that drifts from the north and from the south into the Okanagan Valley. And if those grapes are smothered in smoke throughout the growing season, the grapes take on a bit of a smoke taste, and that ends up in the wine. In fact, one of the major wineries shut down. They canceled their entire 2021 vintage due to this smoke issue. In Australia, the grape industry lost billions of dollars due to smoke tainting. It becomes a complicated issue how crop insurance can cover it when it comes to that kind of tainting, because they're not really set up for dealing with quality loss, more for quantity loss. So in conclusion, farmers play an important role in the food supply chain, but their share of the consumer food dollar is relatively low, as you saw. Shocks in farm production and input prices generally have a small impact on retail prices. The two are kind of independent because there's so many middle stuff going on in between. British Columbia fruit growers are seldom able to fully cover their costs. Climate change is creating considerable uncertainty for the Okanagan fruit growers. So I guess the message is consumers who buy local help to ensure the long-term viability of our local agriculture. Thank you.
Wow, what a fascinating presentation, and also quite frightening as we think about all that smoke and drought and wow, lots to think about and digest. I do have a question for you here. You have highlighted that break-even prices are often above actual prices and that losses are subsidized with off-farm income. Are farmers essentially forced to find additional work to make up for these shortfalls?
Oh, that's a great question. It depends. If you're an older established farmer and you don't have any debt on your land because maybe you paid it off long ago, you can manage. You can probably cover your costs because a lot of these, the numbers you saw were average costs, but some farmers can beat the average and they can. But if you're a new farmer looking to get in where you actually have to buy the land, there's just no way. You would have to use off-farm income. Your spouse would have to have a high-paying job. So you really have to do it for the love of farming. And that's the unfortunate part. Farmers are getting older. And how are we going to get young farmers in to take over?
This is a huge question, but it shows just how passionate farmers are about the work and their lifestyle. Allison, do you want to comment at all about this question?
Yeah, I think it's a really great point. And as Jim highlighted, it's scary. It's a concern point for sure. It's really hard to entice a whole new generation unless it's something you've grown up with, but it's such a vital thing that we need. It's literally sustenance. So it's a concern point for sure. Hopefully with lower interest rates coming in the near to long-term future, hopefully that's something that can help alleviate with land prices and for people to get into the farming industry alongside of reduced and lower costs for the machinery and other major inputs.
So, Allison, I have a question for you. In your presentation, you show that farm land prices have risen sharply over the past few years. Is this increase due to farmers making excess profits and using those profits to bid up the price, or scarce farmland?
Yeah, no, that's a really great question. So, despite the high interest rate environment, demand for farmland remains pretty robust, and the supply of farmland available for sales actually kind of limited. So, we see that translate into higher prices. It's a really fickle thing. And oddly enough, rates were going up in Eastern Canada compared to Western Canada. So rising farmland values, it leads to the discussion of affordability, particularly for new farmers entering the industry, and it's a concern for sure.
Jim, can you tell us a little bit about your thoughts on this question?
I would love to because I have quite a different view. And I believe in the theory that farmers are not very good at taking excess money they make on their operations and investing it in GICs or stocks that they pour it back into the farm. That's what farmers do. They're very good at reinvesting. And that's not a bad thing. But if they start bidding against each other for farmland, of course, what you do is there's a scarce amount of farmland, so you bid up the price. So in some sense, the fact that farmland prices are rising is a reflection that farmers are making some extra money that they can bid. It's different than in British Columbia, where the price of farmland is influenced by hobby farmers, people who want to live outside the city to have a lifestyle. That's different than a wheat farmer in the middle of Alberta. There, it's more my first theory. Thank you.
So we have a question from the audience. They've just put anonymous. So what sort of mechanisms need to be in place to allow farmers to sell direct to consumers? Is such an approach even feasible for the sector at large? Who would like to comment on this first?
I would be happy to take a shot at that. Great question. We can blame our retail stores. I mean, we do have some great stores that are supportive of local agriculture, but mostly the big stores, whether it's Loblaws or Save On Foods or whatever your retailer is, they do not want to deal with local agriculture when it comes to produce. It's just too complicated. It's too seasonal. They love the supply chains. The trucks coming in from California, they come in at the same time, and there's no sort of mucking around. So it's really, really difficult for local farmers outside of farmers markets to break into sort of selling directly to consumers. They've tried everything. I give so much credit to farmers for trying, but these big retailers are just kind of reluctant.
Allison, do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I echo exactly what Jim just said. It's really hard. These larger banners and grocery retailer outlets, they want the security of continued stock and supply to mitigate customers going to other outlets. And unless it's kind of a smaller mom and pop grocer, independent or a smaller one, it is just so hard for farmers to break through that barrier. And like Jim said, it's not for a lack of trying. So supporting local at markets is a real way to support local producers in maximizing their profits at that level as well.
Yes, and I think what's happening is if we as consumers too sort of start demanding local, do you think that's going to make a difference?
If I could just jump in again, there's a great niche of consumers who are doing the right thing. You know, they are demanding local, they're willing to pay the higher price, but that niche unfortunately is too small. Most consumers, especially when you're feeling the pinch of inflation, really have to search for the lower price food. And unfortunately, that's often the food that comes from California because there's such economies of scale that you can buy it less expensive, even though as I showed, the transportation cost isn't that big. And you want to support local, but when you really comes down to it, not too many consumers can afford to do that.
Okay. I just want to jump. I know we're already in the discussion, which is fantastic, but I just want to find out here's another one. These questions are coming in, which is exciting. Again, anonymous. I would disagree with Dr. Verkaman. In our area in central Alberta, the price of farmland is being increased and the availability of it due to the developers that are coming in and purchasing the land. They have deeper pockets than most farmers do. Okay. So do you want to comment on that, Jim?
Absolutely. Yeah, I guess I was thinking of sort of land out in the boonies, but you're right. All bets off. If you have any sort of development potential, if you're anywhere near an urban center, no way a farmer can compete with any kind of commercial enterprise. So that's the kind of issue I was talking about in British Columbia. I mentioned hobby farmers, but it's also any kind of commercial development. We're fortunate in British Columbia to have the Agricultural Land Reserve, which means all agricultural land is protected from development and it has to stay in agriculture. But I know that's not the case in other parts of Canada. So there's always a direct competition between farmland and using it for alternative uses. But thank you for that great clarification.
Okay, so we have a question from Lisa in Cochrane, Alberta. What should we think when we go to a farmer's market and the prices are higher than in the grocery store? That's a good question. Oh, who wants to take that one on? Allison?
Okay, yeah, sure, I can try. So the difference that instantly comes to mind is the scale of the product that's being sold and future prices that are agreed upon for these long-term pricing contracts when you're supplying retailers versus independent, smaller scale sales of agriculture. That's what instantly comes to mind. Um, it's I know it's a kind of an interesting dynamic to have to navigate that because you want to support local, but it's just the difference in the pricing contracts that are secured from these outlets.
Yeah, if I could just jump in, the former point for sure, the scale is just so different. I mean, a farmer with their 1-ton truck having to drive in, 80 kilometers from the farm and set up and then try to get to the farmer's market. You've got your labor to cover, you've got your truck cost to cover versus these large semi trucks moving in from California that can bring the cost per pound way, way down. So it's not surprising. And that's why consumers have to be willing to pay the higher price if they want to keep local agriculture viable.
Fantastic. Well, we are getting more questions coming in. Please remember to put your questions in the chat. Tell us your name and a bit about yourself, such as your location and your profession. We have a question for Jim. Are there concerns within the British Columbia grape and wine industry that there will be an annual reliance on imported grapes from Ontario, for example, or was this year's frost and reduced crop production a one-off situation?
Well, yeah, who's got the crystal ball for that? What we
Mm.
do know is we have something called the VQA, Vinter's Quality Assurance, which means that only British Columbia grapes can get the seal of certification for BC wines. So that prevents cheap California grapes from being imported or Ontario grapes. But now, so we're going to have to change that because we can't have a year where no wine is being produced. So yeah, with climate change, between the smoke tainting and these sort of unusual frost situations, it's going to take a lot of years, I think, to put more frost hardy plants in. So I don't want to be discouraging, but I don't think usually this might be a 1 in 50 a year that a problem like this, but I kind of think we might be seeing it more than 1 in 50, unfortunately.
Scary. Allison, I have a question that's come in for you. Are there any upcoming changes in regulation policy that may negatively impact input pricing for farmers? In the alternative, are there any upcoming changes that may alleviate the stresses on pricing?
That's a big one. To be candid, I'm not quite aware of any upcoming policy changes that can assist or mitigate that. I'm happy to look into it and provide a response after. Maybe Jim has something to add, but there's no policy changes that I'm aware of to assist with price levels for farming or production. The only thing I can think of is they were reviewing the grocery code of conduct and competitiveness in the grocery landscape, but that's more at the consumer pricing level, not at the producer level. I
Jim,
mean, we also do things like temporary foreign workers program, and that
Mhm.
impacts labor costs, but otherwise, nothing instantly comes to mind.
Jim, go
But
ahead.
yeah, if I could just add, I think there's two ways that policies might be influencing, say, wheat producers. One would be the business risk management suite of policies, through crop insurance and various, whole farm insurance programs. They're always going to be looking at that to see whether they can be more effective for farmers. On the other hand, with the climate change policies, fertilizer taxes, reduction in fertilizers have been, and carbon taxes on fuel, that's hurting farmers on the input side. So that's obviously getting a lot of pushback. And so I think if anything, the biggest changes might be coming on the farm input side rather than on the selling price.
So, I mean, we all are experiencing going to the grocery store and the prices are going up. They're a lot different than what we're used to. Sometimes we're a little shocked. And Allison, on one of your graphs, it shows that food wholesale price index has risen faster than the food retail price index. Given this, why are so many people blaming grocery retailers like Loblaws? Shouldn't some of the blame also be directed at food manufacturers such as Kraft and General Mills?
Yeah, absolutely. There's definitely a shared blame in this one. Um, Suppliers and processed food manufacturers have partial blame, but a lot of it too could be contributing to shrinkflation. So when the products size change, but the price is still the same, many of which are cereal and bakery products, so wheat-based products, that's part of the issue as well. Retailers in Canada do have limited market competition, and while many retailers opt to absorb costs for as long as possible, they eventually pass things on to consumer. So the issue isn't maybe necessarily reconfiguring revenue or income models, but it's just that that's not necessarily a problem if you're reconfiguring your margins, if you're faced with consistently higher costs. But the problem is the simultaneous increasing of retailer margins while reporting record-breaking profits, I think. And that's what's not resonating well with people. So I think that's why people are quick to call out Loblaws and other grocery retailers instead of maybe considering Kraft or General Mills, because they too are part of the puzzle.
Thanks for clarifying that, Allison. So we have another question from the audience that's come in, and I'm going to direct this to you, Jim. Given the advancements in the use of technology and the prevalence of precision farming, is there a possibility to see a change in the profitability or portion of the price pie for farmers?
Boy, I would love to be optimistic in answering this question, but we've seen this issue I've been talking about is not new. We've seen the low share of farmers capturing the consumer dollar for many, many years. We've seen lots of technological advances that have benefited farmers, whether it's, GPS steering or whatever else. And we really haven't budged the needle very much in terms of what I showed you on my earlier slides. So possibly, we could move towards reducing that margin, the middleman, the evil middleman, but I don't see any technology right now. We've got apps, food apps that maybe consumers can use to buy more directly, but nothing really comes to mind that's going to make a big difference in the immediate future.
Allison, do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, just mentioning, it just got me thinking towards the end of Jim's comment there. There are different programs that tend to use local produce or try to source it as much as possible. So I'm thinking more of like those meals that you can customize and get delivered to your house. There's some of them that are now like focused on zero waste, local production, and that's a direct way through technology, through different websites or app programs that could be starting to bridge that gap. But
Okay, so we have a question for you, Allison. You mentioned that crop insurance claims are Complicated. What is the typical processing time for a crop insurance claim? Are producers required to participate in crop insurance coverage programs in British Columbia? Actually, was that for,
I
that
think that
was for
might be
you,
for
Jim?
me. Yeah,
Yeah.
Sorry.
if it's British Columbia, I'll take that question.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, you mean, as I mentioned earlier, the federal government and the provincial government share in this business risk management suite of products, crop insurance just being one of them. Nothing is mandatory, but highly encouraged, because what governments don't want is to sort of have to come up with these disaster payments when something bad happens to an entire sector. They really want farmers to sort of try to manage the risk themselves. So they sort of try to provide them with pretty subsidized premium rates, and they cover the administration cost of the crop insurance. But so to answer your question, it's kind of complicated. Nothing is mandatory, but to be eligible for some programs, you have to have crop insurance. And like I said earlier, though, the crop insurance gets really complicated on some claims. Like if you have smoke damage to your grapes, that's going to maybe mess up your wine. We really haven't figured that out yet. We're really good at adjusting quantity loss, but not so much quality loss.
I think we could do a whole discussion just on insurance and looking at the fine print and making sure that you're actually covered for what might be on the horizon, right?
Absolutely.
You got to get that magnifying glass out. Allison, do you want to comment on this?
Yeah, I guess I'm a little biased because I did work at a provincial level at an agricultural insurance corporation. So it was literally designing and working with actuaries on, what the losses would be and how we can support producers if there was a disease outbreak or a climate issue that led to reduced production. So yeah, even though they can be costly and they can take quite some time, even the response time in which a program response is designated, set up, and gone through, it's quite some time. So it can be a lengthy timeline for producers as well to be compensated if they meet the thresholds for the ag recovery stability programming. I still do recommend it though, but maybe I'm just a little biased. So that's full disclosure there.
Lots to think about and lots of reading to do when you get the policy. So, Allison, another question for you. Farmers must buy expensive inputs like fertilizer and crop protection before they even know if a drought or flood will result in low production yields. With these events becoming more common due to climate change, what can farmers do to protect themselves from major financial losses caused by high input costs and low revenues?
Yeah, that's a good one. It's becoming more and more commonplace, it seems. So not to be redundant, but I would go back to what we were just talking about insurance and stability program participations. Even if it's not mandatory, I would take a good hard look at some historical climate trends in the area in which you're farming and the crop in which you're looking to produce or expand in to produce. And I would probably participate in insurance and stability programming. It's not the end all. I mean, hopefully the adage, what comes up must come down, will sometimes come down or sometime soon come down further for these large input products and prices that farmers have to face. But yeah, I personally would be doing insurance and stability program participation myself.
And Jim, do you have a comment on this before we wrap up?
No, just 100% agreement with
Oh,
Allison.
Oh, I have one more question that just came in under the line here. If British Columbia fruit growers are seldom able to fully cover their costs, how can we ensure farming operations will continue in British Columbia, Jim?
Well, there's no guarantees, but you know what? Farmers are a resilient bunch. They find ways to the land is protected to remain in agriculture. They love farming, so older farmers will pass it down to younger farmers, and somehow they'll muddle their way through that, and hopefully the profitability will start to improve relative to the data I showed.
And any last words for the audience as we think about the future, Allison?
Ooh, big question. That's a big open-ended question. We've got a lot to think about from today's conversation. I think, as Jim said, farmers are resilient. They'll continue to forge a path forward. The landscape in which it's transpiring in is a little bit different than what it was, but hopefully we'll see a reduction in input costs so producers can continue successful long-term sustainable operations, and that in turn can provide enough supply to reduce consumer prices.
And how about from you, Jim?
Well, I would just like to put a plug for your Simpson School of Public Policy, because what you're doing is exactly what we need. We need to educate consumers and people who don't quite understand the full supply chains and where the issues are and the constraints. And the more we understand it, the more we can move towards effectively solving some of the problems that we currently face.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Allison and Jim, for sharing your knowledge with us today. To our participants, you will receive a post-event survey and those links. Our next webinar towards the end of June will look at food labeling. What does it mean when we read organic or grain-fed? How do those labels tell us about the production of our food? Please go to the simpsoncenter.ca website and subscribe to hear more about upcoming events and receive our monthly newsletter for information based on research about Canadian food production. Thank you very much for joining us today.